The high country lay hushed beneath a sky of hammered tin, the last light catching on drifts of old snow that clung to the northern slopes. Spring had not yet found courage enough to cross the divide, and the wind that came down from the peaks carried both the bite of winter and the promise of thaw. Along the willow-lined banks of the Green River, a small encampment of trappers stirred smoke curling thinly from their fire, mingling with the smell of tanned hides and boiled coffee. Men like these had no country but the wilderness, no law but their own. They came from Kentucky, Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, driven westward by the scent of profit and the kind of restlessness that cities could not cure. They called themselves mountain men, and their currency was beaver. For a few short years, the world had need of them. Among the company that season were two men whose names the old journals still record in faint ink: Elias Finch, a veteran of the early rendezvous, and Tom Blaine, a younger man lately arrived from Street Louis with the sublet outfit. Finch was already gray around the temples, his beard thick and pale as badger fur, his hands roughened by 30 winters on the trap line. Men said he had trapped with Bridger on the Yellowstone and once ridden with Jedediah Smith before the Mojave took him. Blaine, by contrast, still carried the raw eagerness of youth, broad-shouldered, quick to laugh, quicker still to take offense. He wore his belt low, his knife high, and talked as if he'd swallowed a dose of the frontier whole and was still trying to digest it. The Green River Valley was neutral ground for the fur men, but peace in the wilderness was as fragile as glass. By the time Finch and Blaine's paths crossed, the trade was already dying. The beaver were scarce, the market shrinking, and word had reached the camps that silk hats in the East had made felt a fashion of the past. Still, the men stayed on, half from habit, half from the quiet terror of not knowing what else to be. It began, as such things often did, with whiskey. That night the fire burned low in a ring of stones, throwing a dull glow against the hides strung to dry. Finch sat cross-legged near the coals, mending a torn moccasin, while Blaine and two other young trappers passed a bottle between them. The talk ran easy for a while: weather, sign, prices at the last rendezvous near Horse Creek. Then Blaine, already flushed from drink, began boasting of his luck along a creek in Crow Country, a narrow run thick with willow and beaver sign. "Trapped a dozen prime pelts in 2 days," he said, raising the bottle in salute. A man could make his fortune there if he kept quiet and held his ground. Finch looked up at that. The firelight carved his face into planes of shadow and scar. "You mean along Blacktail Creek?" "That's the one," Blaine replied. "Flows down from the east shoulder of the Gros Ventres." Finch's hand stilled on the moccasin. "That ain't open ground," he said quietly. "I laid steel there 6 years past, and the Crows still know it by my name. You been trespassing, boy." The air around the fire tightened like a drawn bow. The younger trappers exchanged uneasy glances. Blaine laughed, but the sound was brittle. "Didn't see your name carved on a tree, old man," he said. "And I don't recall the Crow electin' you their steward." Finch set the moccasin aside. "Some things don't need carvin'. A man's word's enough." "Maybe in your time," Blaine said, "but times change." For a moment, only the fire spoke soft hisses as sap bled from a log. Outside the ring of light, the dark pressed close. Somewhere in it, an elk bugled once, low and distant. Finch rose slowly to his feet. He was not a tall man, but there was something in his bearing that made the others shift aside. "There's honor among us," he said. "Always has been. You'd do well to remember that before you steal another man's line." Blaine's jaw tightened. "Honor?" he spat. "Ain't no honor in starvation. Beaver's beaver, wherever a man finds it." The old trapper's eyes glinted blue, cold, steady. "Then you'd best pray the beaver's the only thing that finds you." It might have ended there, with harsh words cooling in the mountain air, had it not been for the woman. Her name was Marie White Crow, daughter of a Crow mother and a French interpreter once stationed at Fort Union. She had been living among the trappers that season, guiding and trading, speaking both tongues with the easy grace of one who belonged to neither world completely. Finch had known her since she was a child, her father having died on the Yellowstone years before. Blaine, however, had taken to her with a young man's reckless heart, mistaking her kindness for promise. 2 nights after the quarrel, word spread through camp that Blaine had asked Marie to travel south with him when the thaw came. She had refused. When Finch heard, he said nothing, but others noticed the way Blaine's eyes followed him afterward, sharp and bright with suspicion. By late May, the camps began to thin. Men packed their pelts and drifted toward the plains, toward the trading forts, and whatever fortune still waited there. Finch meant to do the same, driving his mules west through the Hoback Basin. Blaine lingered, claiming business unfinished. On the evening before Finch's departure, as he sat oiling his rifle beneath a sky bruised with cloud, Blaine came striding out of the shadows. The camp was nearly deserted. Only the sound of the river and the clank of mules drifted through the dusk. "You leavin' at dawn?" Blaine asked. "I am," Finch said. Blaine nodded. "Then let's settle it before you go." Finch didn't look up. "Settle what? You know damn well what." Blaine's voice trembled with heat. "You turned her against me, told her lies." "I told her truth," Finch said. "You'd use her same as you used my line." Blaine's hand hovered near his belt. "You callin' me a thief and a liar both?" "I'm callin' you a fool," Finch said evenly. "And a fool don't last long out here." For a heartbeat, neither moved. The wind picked up, whispering through the willows. Then Blaine's hand fell away from his belt, not in peace, but in promise. "Tomorrow," he said, "at first light, down by the bend where the creek forks. Rifles, 50 paces. We'll see whose word stands." Finch met his gaze. "So be it." When Blaine turned and vanished into the darkness, the old trapper sat still a long while, the oiled cloth limp in his hands. Somewhere behind him, Marie's shadow stirred by the lodge flap. "Elias," she said softly, "don't." He looked up at her, eyes weary as the mountains themselves. "Ain't my choice any more, girl. The wilderness decides for men like us." She said nothing more. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of snow from the high ridges. Finch laid his rifle across his knees and watched the fire die. In the wilderness, dawn always came early, but never early enough to stop what must come. Tomorrow, the mountains would have their due. By the time dawn slipped over the high ridges, the sky was the color of wet slate. A thin mist clung to the willows, and the river muttered against the stones as though warning the men to turn back. Elias Finch was already awake, sitting by the ashes of his fire, cleaning the flint of his rifle with the deliberate calm of someone who knew how little calm was left to him. Across the flat, Tom Blaine's figure moved through the fog, tall, restless, pacing the ground where the duel would be settled. They had agreed upon the place the night before, a shallow bend in the creek, 50 paces marked out between 2 cottonwoods that had grown from the same root. The irony hadn't escaped. Finch, 2 trees sharing one trunk, divided, only above the earth. It seemed fitting. But before that gray morning, before the smoke of powder would mix with river fog, the story had been set in motion long before either man knew it. Tom Blaine had been born in 1808 near Boonville, Missouri, to a family of rivermen. His father had ferried flatboats down the Mississippi. His mother had died of fever before he was grown, and the frontier had raised him rough and hungry. He'd served a brief spell as a scout during the Black Hawk War, learning how to ride light, shoot straight, and never trust a silence that lasted too long. When the fur trade fever swept through Street, Louis, he joined the sublet outfit, drawn by the promise that a man could earn more in one trapping season than a soldier did in 3 years. He was quick with his rifle, quicker with his temper. The older hands called him Rawhide Tom, for the way he snapped under strain, tough but unseasoned. Still, there was no denying his skill. He could set a trap in a frozen creek with bare hands, skin a beaver clean, and ride 50 miles of wilderness without compass or guide. Elias Finch, on the other hand, belonged to an older breed, one of the last of the Jedediah Smith generation. Born in the Shenandoah Valley, he had come west long before there were forts or maps to guide him. He had trapped the Yellowstone when it was still unknown country, followed Ashley's men through the South Pass, and wintered with the Crow when the plains were still theirs by right of distance and fear. He had buried partners, fought off Arikara along the Missouri, and lived long enough to see civilization creeping west like a sickness forts, sprouting up where once only cottonwoods grew. Where Blaine chased profit, Finch carried a different sort of hunger, the need to keep something wild in a world that was closing in. Their first meeting had been almost cordial. Blaine had admired Finch's stories, half in awe, half in doubt. But as the winter deepened and the pelts grew scarce, admiration turned to envy. Finch's traps always seemed to fill where others failed, and when spring came, word spread that he had found a silver run, a creek thick with untouched beaver sign. He kept its location secret, as every trapper did, but the younger men whispered guesses by firelight, each certain he knew where the old man went at dawn. Blaine followed one morning, keeping downwind, his horse's hooves muffled in snow. What he found was a narrow canyon off Blacktail Creek, steam rising where the sun struck it, the banks pocked with the marks of beaver slides. Finch's traps gleamed in the shallows, staked with care. Blaine rode back to camp, saying nothing, but a week later his own traps lined the same water. Finch found them and knew. That evening he had gone to Blaine's fire, the silence between them broken only by the sound of a whetstone on steel. "You knew whose ground that was," Finch said. Blaine didn't look up. "Didn't see your mark." "My mark's been there since before you came west. Maybe it's time new men made their own." Finch studied him, the young man's eyes bright with pride, his knuckles white on the knife handle. "The mountain don't care how new you are," he said. "She breaks fools all the same." That was when Marie White Crow stepped between them. She had been raised among the Crow, but carried her father's French manner, soft speech, straight spine. To her, both men were mirrors of two worlds, one fading, one rising. She had tried to calm the quarrel, speaking to Blaine in Crow, to Finch in English, her voice quiet as snow. But men who live too long in silence hear only what their pride allows. In the weeks that followed, her presence became a spark neither man could touch without flame. Blaine mistook her kindness for affection, and when she refused him, he convinced himself Finch had poisoned her against him. By late May, the Green River, camps were emptying, Sublet's wagons were due at Horse Creek, and most trappers were heading east with their pelts. Finch was ready to do the same until Blaine's challenge hung in the air like gun smoke. Now, as the first light of morning slid down the slopes, both men stood at the creek bend. Finch checked the flint in his rifle, breathing slow. Blaine turned once, eyes hard, coat open to the cold. 50 paces, Blaine said. "We fire on the count of 3. Finch nodded. "No more talk, then." They walked in opposite directions, their boots crunching the frost. The mist swallowed them until only the echo of their steps remained. At 50 paces, they turned. "1," Blaine called. Finch raised his rifle. 2. The river held its breath. The 2 shots cracked as one. When the smoke cleared, Finch was standing. Blaine had fallen to one knee, a dark bloom spreading beneath his shoulder. His rifle dropped, clattering against stone. Finch started, forward, but the younger man waved him off. "Don't," Blaine said hoarsely. "You've had your word." Finch stopped, the river murmuring between them. Blaine's wound was not mortal, but the pride that burned in him was. He would live, and so would the story. By the time word reached the trading fort, the tale had grown, that Finch had shot a man in cold blood, that it wasn't a duel, but murder. The frontier had no courts, but the army had begun to reach into these mountains, bringing with it the laws of men who'd never seen the wilderness. And so, what had begun as a trapper's quarrel would soon become something else entirely, the first test of whether the wilderness would remain its own law or bend beneath the weight of civilization. Dawn bled slow over the mountains the next morning, red as a wound. The sun broke through the fog and spilled across the valley, glinting off rifles, traps, and wagon iron. The Green River rolled cold and indifferent beside the cottonwoods. A few miles downstream, 2 men rode toward Fort Bonneville, one upright in the saddle, the other slumped and pale, his shirt dark with dried blood. Elias Finch kept his horse steady, guiding both mounts through the sage. Blaine swayed with each step of his mule, his breath shallow. He hadn't spoken since the duel. Pride was a stubborn medicine, but it didn't stop the bleeding. At the fort, word traveled faster than horses. Trappers, traders, and idle hands came out to see some curious, some wary. The wilderness loved a story, and this one had teeth. Finch shot him clean through, one man said. Near tore the shoulder off, another added. Duels ain't law, someone muttered. Ain't been for years, not since the territory took hold. That was new talk law on the frontier. It had been drifting west like smoke from the cities, U.S. Marshals, territorial judges, the first whispers of courts. The mountains, long ruled by reputation and rifle, were beginning to answer to papers stamped with seals and signatures. When Finch carried Blaine into the stockade yard, he met the gaze of Captain Andrew Summers, commander of the small detachment stationed there. Summers was a young officer out of West Point, his boots still polished, his mind full of regulations. He looked at Finch as though sizing a species he'd only read about. "What happened here?" Summers asked. "Accident of honor," Finch said quietly. "We settled it by the old ways." The captain frowned. "You mean by gunfire?" "That's the way of it in these hills." "Not any more," Summers replied. "Not under U.S. law," he gestured, and two soldiers stepped forward, rifles in hand. For the first time in 30 years of wilderness, Elias Finch felt the cold weight of arrest. The days that followed were heavy and strange. Finch was confined to a makeshift cell, a storage room beside the trading post, its walls built of logs and chinking, its air thick with dust and damp hides. He had known hunger, cold, ambush, and solitude, but never confinement. The door closed behind him, like the end of an era. Marie White Crow came to see him once. She carried no words of comfort, only a quiet sorrow. "They say Tom will live," she told him. Finch nodded. "Good. He told the officer you shot first." Finch gave a faint, tired smile. "Maybe I did, maybe he did. Makes no difference now. The law'll say what it wants." She hesitated, her dark eyes searching his. "Why didn't you just walk away?" He looked past her, toward the window where the light slipped through the cracks. "Because a man don't walk from his own word. Out here, it's all we got." When the territorial judge arrived a week later from Fort Laramie, the trial was held in the open air, the first of its kind in that country. Traders, missionaries, and soldiers gathered under a canvas awning. The mountains loomed beyond, silent witnesses to a civilization trying to root itself in stone. Finch stood unshackled, his weathered coat patched, his hat in his hands. Blaine sat nearby, his arm in a sling, face pale but proud. Between them lay the vast gulf between two frontiers, one fading into myth, the other rising on the back of law. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced clerk named Edward Tillman, read from a tattered statute book. "To engage in a duel with deadly weapons," he said, "is an act of murder under the territorial code, regardless of consent." Tillman looked up. "The accused admits to firing his weapon. The victim survives by providence, not restraint. This," he held up the code, "is the new law of the West." Finch said nothing until called to speak. His voice was low, calm, even respectful. "I don't deny what I done," he said. "But I done it fair. We met by agreement, both knowing the cost. Out here, a man's life is his own to wager, always has been." Tillman sneered. "So the wilderness excuses killing?" "It excuses truth," Finch said. "And sometimes truth costs blood." A murmur passed through the onlookers, trappers nodding, soldiers frowning. The judge tapped his gavel, a sound absurdly small against the vastness of the plains. In the end, the verdict struck a strange balance between eras. The court found Finch guilty of reckless endangerment of life, but not of murder. His sentence: 1 year's banishment from all federal trading grounds and the forfeiture of his trapping license. The law had spoken, but it was the wilderness that enforced it. When the proceedings ended, Finch walked out into the sunlight, free in name but not in spirit. Marie waited near the hitching post. "They're sending you south?" she asked. He nodded. "Fort Bent, maybe beyond." "Ain't many places left for an old trapper now." She reached into her shawl and handed him a small pouch braided leather, crow-made. "Tobacco," she said, "for the road." He took it, rough fingers brushing hers. "You tell Blaine he was a good shot. Might have been better than me." She smiled faintly. "He already knows." For a long while they stood in silence, the fort behind them alive with noise, hammering, laughter, the voices of men building something they called progress. Finch turned his horse toward the southern trail. He didn't look back. The wind caught his coat and carried the smell of sage and smoke down the valley. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay the next frontier, not of wilderness, but of law. The duel was over, but its echo would carry through the courts of the territories for decades, cited by judges who had never known the feel of mountain snow or the sound of a rifle's lonely crack in the dawn. And, as the old trappers later told it by firelight, that was the day the West began to change, the day when a man's word ceased to be enough and paper and ink took its place. By the time the mountain winds turned sharp again. The duel of the Green River had traveled farther than any of the men who fought it. From the trappers' camps at Horse Creek to the trading houses in Street, Louis. The story grew like wildfire, each telling, burning away truth and leaving behind a legend. Some said Finch had killed Blaine outright and fled into Crow country. Others swore he'd been shot through the heart, but refused to fall until he'd returned fire. The details mattered less than the symbol it had become, the frontier's last duel, a collision between wilderness, honor, and the creeping reach of civilization. In taverns and counting houses along the Mississippi, merchants and lawyers debated the meaning of it. The fur trade was waning, the frontier tightening. And if the old wilderness codes could not stand before the law, what else might fall next? In late September, a courier arrived in Street, Louis, carrying an official report from Fort Bonneville signed by Captain Summers and countersigned by the territorial judge. It summarized the event in the clean, bloodless language of bureaucracy. An altercation between two licensed trappers, Elias Finch and Thomas Blaine, resulted in an exchange of gunfire by mutual consent. The incident, though governed by what the participants termed code of honor, was deemed unlawful under the statutes of the territory. The ruling, therefore, establishes precedent for the prosecution of dueling west of the Missouri line. To men who dealt in ink and seal, those few lines meant little. But to those who lived beyond the edge of the maps, it was thunder. At the American Fur Company headquarters, clerks and factors read the dispatch with tight jaws. Dueling had long been the rough justice of the frontier, a way to settle what the wilderness could not. Now, if a quarrel led to blood, it could mean forfeited licenses, confiscated pelts, or worse, imprisonment in the new forts that dotted the plains. Old hands like Jim Bridger and Kit Carson shrugged it off, saying no judge alive could reach as far as the mountains. But others, especially the younger traders, already weary of risk, began to talk of caution, of written agreements and official boundaries. The mountains were still wild, but the wildness was being weighed, measured, and priced. Far south, Elias Finch rode the Santa Fe Trail alone. The sentence had exiled him from the northern posts, and though his name was whispered with respect among trappers, the doors of the big companies were closed to him. He stopped sometimes at small camps, Spanish traders, Pawnee scouts, lone hunters, but he never lingered. The road dust gathered in his beard, and his coat grew thin. The law had not imprisoned him, but it had done worse. It had stripped him of belonging. One night, as he camped near the Arkansas River, a wagon train bound for Bent's Fort stopped nearby. Among them rode a newspaper correspondent from Street Louis, a thin man with spectacles and an after ink-stained journal. He recognized Finch's name from the report and asked to share his fire. "I've written about your case," the man said, warming his hands. "They call it the Green River Affair." Finch gave a dry chuckle. "Affair, is it? Sounds prettier than it was." The writer nodded. It stirred up quite a debate. Congressmen say it's proof the frontier needs proper law, sheriffs, judges, courts. Some even claim it's the start of a new code for the territories. Finch poked the fire with a stick. "Codes," he murmured. Men in the East love their codes. Out here, a man's word used to be one. You don't think law belongs west of the Missouri? Finch thought a long while before answering. Law's a good thing, but it don't belong to men who ain't earned it yet. Out here, you don't just write justice, you bleed for it. Maybe someday, when the land's tamed enough to listen, the law means something, but not yet. Reporter wrote that down, though he never printed it. To Eastern readers, Finch's kind was a relic half savage, half saint, an artifact of a vanishing time, back in street. Louis, the Green River ruling, began to ripple through the legal frontier. In December 1833, a territorial judge cited the case in a decision over a knife duel at Fort Laramie, declaring, "Let it be understood that the personal codes of trappers and free men shall yield to the uniform rule of law. The wilderness is not beyond the reach of justice." The phrase caught on. Not beyond the reach of justice. It appeared in pamphlets, sermons, and editorials printed alongside cautionary tales of the rough frontier. To city men, it sounded noble. To mountain men, it sounded like a noose tightening. By the following spring, the new trade regulations required every licensed trapper to sign a clause renouncing dueling, affray, or violence under code of honor. The American Fur Company posted the rule at every fort and rendezvous. Violators would lose their right to trade. Many scoffed at it, but most signed anyway. Profit had a way of bending pride. And so, little by little, the wild, unwritten law of the mountains, the code that had governed Ashley's men, Smith, Bridger, and Glass, began to fade. In its place rose a paper world of seals and signatures, where justice was measured not by courage, but by compliance. When spring broke again, Finch was last seen near Taos, guiding a wagon train through the Raton Pass. The journal of a young clerk from that party recorded his final glimpse. An old trapper rode beside me, his rifle wrapped in hide, his eyes fixed on the mountains behind. He said little, save this, "Ain't no man bigger than the law." But once the law had to earn its size. No one knows where he went after that. Some said he died near the Canadian River, others that he crossed into Mexico and took up trading mules. Whatever became of him, the name Elias Finch lived on in courtrooms and campfire tales alike. For the lawyers, he was a precedent. For the trappers, a warning. For the wilderness, a memory of the last time a man's word still carried the weight of law. By the time the rails had found the foothills of the Wind River Range, few living souls still remembered the duel at Green River, but the mountains did. They remembered everything. The rivers that once ran red with spring snowmelt now ran brown with silt from miners' pans. The air that once rang with the crack of a Hawken rifle now echoed with the whistle of steam. The wilderness that had tested men like Elias Finch was giving way to a new world of towns, telegraphs, and timetables. South of the old trappers' trails, near the place where the Green and the Hoback still twist together in a slow, cold dance, a small settlement had taken root. Finch's Crossing, they called it. No one knew for sure who named it so. Some said a trader's son had found Finch's old traps, rusting by the creek. Others swore it was the site of the duel itself. Whatever the truth, the name clung to the land like old blood to stone. By then, the Wilderness Code, the unwritten law that once ruled the Rockies, was little more than legend. The younger generation of settlers, clerks, and soldiers knew it only through the tall tales told by gray-bearded relics around tavern fires. But for those who still carried the mountain in their bones, the name Elias Finch was spoken with the reverence reserved for ghosts. One such man was Nathaniel Nate Burdett, sheriff of Finch's Crossing. He was born the same year Finch fought his duel 1833, back when the West was still rumor and danger. By the time Nate pinned on a tin star, the law had become more than paper. It was muscle, steel, and rope. But he still believed that justice, to mean anything, had to be earned. He'd grown up listening to his father, a mule skinner who once trapped near the Yellowstone, tell stories of Finch and Blaine. To Nate, those tales weren't about killing, but about balance, the old world giving way to the new. And when the first miners arrived, bringing whiskey, gambling, and the kind of disputes that ended with bodies in the river, the sheriff found himself walking the same narrow trail Finch once had, between the code of the wilderness and the law of the land. That summer, trouble came in the form of a drifter named Caleb Varn, a big man with a preacher's voice and a killer's patience. He'd ridden up from the Utah line with a pack train and a habit of settling debts by draw. By the second week in town, he'd already bloodied 2 men and threatened a third. When Burdett confronted him outside the saloon, Varn only smiled. "You call this justice, Sheriff? A badge and a book? Out here, a man still settles his own reckoning." Nate met his gaze, the reflection of the sun glinting off the star on his vest. "That day's gone," he said, quietly. Elias Finch buried it on the Green River near 40 years ago. Varn spat in the dust. "Then maybe I'll dig it back up." That night, Nate sat in his small office reading through the territorial codebook, the same law that had once condemned Finch. The ink was faded, the pages cracked, but the words still burned with their stubborn certainty. "No act of violence by mutual consent shall be deemed lawful under the statutes of the United States or its territories." He closed the book and stared into the lantern flame. Somewhere in those mountains, Finch's ghost must have been laughing. The next morning, Varn sent word. A challenge. Pistols at dawn by the riverbank, like the old-timers used to do. Burdett rode out before sunrise. The willows whispered in the wind, and the river moved dark and slow, as though it knew this place had seen enough blood. Varn was waiting, his long coat flapping in the chill. "Didn't think you'd come," he said. "I came," Nate replied, "to make sure no one else ever tries this again." He dropped his hand to his holster, not for his gun, but for the badge pinned beside it. He tore it free and tossed it in the dust between them. "You want justice, Varn? There it is. Shoot a man wearing it, and you'll hang before sundown." For a heartbeat, the air stood still. The echo of Finch's duel seemed to hang over the river, the same land, the same choice, the same temptation to let pride outweigh reason. Then Varn laughed, a dry, ugly sound. "You got iron, Sheriff. I'll give you that." He holstered his pistol, turned his horse, and rode off toward the mountains. Burdett waited until he was gone, then picked up the badge and wiped it clean. By noon, word of the standoff had spread through Finch's Crossing. The townsfolk gathered outside the jail, eager for the tale. An old trapper, one of the last of the rendezvous men, spat his tobacco and said, "Ain't the first time. That river's seen a man spared by pride." Burdett looked east toward the rising line of the railroad. Smoke coiled across the horizon, the future arriving on schedule. "No," he said softly, "but maybe it's the last." That evening, he sat on the porch of his office and unfolded a yellowed copy of the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal, sent by a schoolteacher from Fort Bridger. Inside was a short essay titled "The Duel That Changed the West." It described Finch and Blaine, the trial, and the precedent that followed. Beneath it, in small print, was a note. This account, drawn from the Journal of Charles Larpenteur and from official territorial proceedings, Fort Bonneville, 1833. Burdett read it twice, then folded it back carefully. He stared into the sunset, where the sky burned gold behind the peaks. The wind came down from the mountains that night, cold, pure, unbroken, carrying the faint smell of sage and snow. Somewhere a coyote called, and the sound lingered like memory. The sheriff closed his eyes and thought of the men who came before Finch, Blaine, Bridger, Carson, men who had carved paths through silence and left behind a country that no longer knew their names. Yet in every town that rose, in every courthouse built on what once was open land, their ghosts remained. They were the mortar in the walls, the shadow in the light of progress, reminders that law, for all its weight, was born not from ink, but from blood and wilderness. As darkness settled over Finch's Crossing, the last stars blinked awake above the Rockies, the same stars that had watched a duel, a trial, and a reckoning long ago. The wilderness was tamed, yes, but the memory of the men who gave it law still rode the wind, whispering through pine and canyon alike. Justice, like the mountains, must be earned. The train from Cheyenne wheezed to a stop beneath a sky as pale as smoke. Steam hissed, horses stamped, and the scent of coal mingled with sage. The mountains still stood in the distance, ragged and blue, unchanged, but everything else had shifted. Telegraph poles lined the valley now like ribs of some great dead beast, and where once only the tents of trappers had stood, the town of Green River Junction sprawled with brick depots and warehouses. Among the passengers who stepped down that morning was a woman wrapped in a traveling shawl of crow beadwork and wool. Her name was Isabel Finch White Crow, though few who saw her knew what that meant. She was in her late 50s, with streaks of silver in her black hair and a face that had known both mountain wind and city air. She had come from Helena after receiving a letter, a faded document discovered in an old military chest from Fort Bonneville, marked with a seal and the words, "Case of Elias Finch, 1833. The world had moved on. The railroad men cared little for the stories buried under their tracks, but Isabel did. Her grandmother had been Marie White Crow, the interpreter who once walked between two worlds, and her grandfather, though the family never spoke it aloud, had been Elias Finch himself. She had grown up with fragments, an old rifle that no one dared sell, a pouch of tobacco gone dry, and a legend whispered over winter fires. Now she had come to see what was left. The clerk at the county hall barely looked up when she entered. "Historical records are in the back," he muttered. "Shelf-marked territorial archives." She found the file easily thin, brittle papers held together by twine. The ink had faded to a rust color. There was the judgment from 1833, the testimony of Captain Summers, and the signature of Finch himself, uneven as though written with a shaking hand. Then she found something else. A letter tucked inside, addressed to "whom it may concern, should these words outlive me." It was unsigned, but she knew. "I reckon the wilderness will not remember men like me, for it was never meant to, but if it must, let it remember this. I never drew my rifle for hatred, only for honor, and I reckon that's a poor excuse. The law they made out of my name will save men from themselves, but it'll cost them the thing that made them men. Still, better that than the blood we spilled to learn it." She traced the words with her finger, feeling the tremor of the man who had written them. Her throat tightened. The duel that had once been whispered in judgment was now a relic of history, proof of a nation learning to bind its own wildness. That afternoon, Isabel hired a wagon and rode west into the foothills. The road followed the river as it wound between low buttes and groves of aspen, their leaves trembling gold in the wind. After a few hours, the driver halted. "This is as far as the trail goes, ma'am. The rest is wild country." She continued on foot, following the riverbank. The light turned amber, then deepened toward dusk. The water murmured beside her, and somewhere upstream a bull elk called, echoing through the canyons. By twilight she found it a bend in the green, where the willows grew thick and the stones showed scars of old fire. Nothing marked the place but silence. She knelt by the water and drew from her bag a small tin box. Inside was a scrap of flint and a few curls of tobacco leaf, brown with age. She scattered them into the current. "For you, grandfather," she whispered. The river carried the offering away, curling smoke-like through the eddies. She thought of all the stories buried here, the duel, the trial, the exile, and how each had shaped a country that now measured justice in columns of law rather than paces of earth. Yet, as she sat listening to the wind, she began to understand what Finch himself might have known in those final years. That the law of the frontier had never been about defiance, but about reckoning a man's quiet acceptance, that his word, his choices, and his name would one day be judged by something greater than himself. The stars were out when she started back. Far down the valley, the faint whistle of a locomotive drifted on the wind. It sounded mournful, almost human, as if the iron beast itself grieved for the wilderness it had devoured. She paused and looked once more at the mountains, the same dark teeth of stone that had watched her ancestor ride through snow and storm. Time had washed away the fur traders, the trappers, the crows who once guided them, even the duels that decided fates. but the silence remained. It was the same silence Finch must have heard that morning by the creek, when he faced a younger man and a changing world. That silence, she thought, was the last true law of the West, the one no court could write, and no rail could cross. When Isabel returned to Helena weeks later, she gave the letter to the Territorial Museum. The curator, a spectacled historian from Boston, read it carefully. "Remarkable," he said. "This Finch, he may have shaped the first legal boss, precedent for homicide and self-defense west of the Missouri." "Did you know that?" She smiled faintly. "He didn't mean to make law," she said. "He just meant to keep his word." The historian blinked, uncertain what to say. That night, as the snow began to fall outside her boarding house, Isabel sat by the window and thought of how history always tamed its wildest men, turning their pain into paragraphs, their choices into statutes. But she also knew that somewhere beyond the printed page, in the wind and the stone, their true voices still lingered. She opened the window, letting the cold air sweep in. Somewhere out there, the mountains still waited, unchanged, unbroken, vast as truth. And for a moment she thought she heard a voice in the wind, rough, steady, familiar whispering words, not of pride or sorrow, but of simple understanding. "Justice is for men. Silence is for the mountains. I've had my share of both." She closed the window, the sound fading into the night. The story of Elias Finch had ended long ago, yet it lived on, not in books or courts, but in the very breath of the land he had once called home. The thaw came late that year. The snows lingered on the high passes until April, and when they finally gave way, the Green River swelled like a thing reborn, dark and furious, carrying whole trees in its current. The ranchers in the valley cursed it. The miners upriver thanked it for turning their sluices. But among the few who still walked its banks without purpose was an old man named Henry Burdett, grandson of Sheriff Nathaniel Burdett of Finch's Crossing, and great-great-grandson, though he did not know it, of Elias Finch himself. Henry was 74, tall and thin as fence wire, with a limp from a bullet earned chasing cattle rustlers 20 years earlier. His cabin stood on a bluff overlooking the bend of the river, once called the Dueller's Crossing by locals, though the maps had long since erased the name. He'd been a ranch hand, a deputy, a prospector, and now mostly a storyteller. Every evening he would walk down to the water with his pipe and his old dog, Duke, and sit on a log half buried in the sand. He'd smoke, listen to the river, and talk to it as if it were an old companion. Some nights he told it stories. Other nights it told him. That spring brought visitors 3 young men from Laramie, students of the State University. They were traveling the old fur trade routes, collecting oral histories for a book on the laws of the frontier. They'd heard of Henry Burdett from a rancher in Big Piney who said the old man carried more history in his head than the courthouse carried in its vault. They arrived one morning in a Model T that groaned over the ruts of the wagon trail. Henry watched from his porch, pipe in hand, as the machine shuddered to a stop and the young men climbed out, slick-haired, city-voiced, wearing ties even in the dust. "Mr. Burdett?" one called. "We've come to ask you about the old days, the trappers, the lawmen, the stories of this country." Henry squinted through the smoke. "Stories, is it? You sure you want the truth? The truth don't sell like tales." They laughed politely, and one of them opened a notebook. "We heard your grandfather was a sheriff here, that he once faced down a gunman without firing a shot." Henry smiled faintly. "That'd be Nate, a good man. Learned his courage from silence, not from noise." "And before him," the student continued, "there was talk of a duel that changed the laws of the West, a man named Finch Elias Finch. Do you know that story?" The old man's eyes narrowed. "Funny thing, you bring that name here. Been near 80 years since anyone spoke it on this land." He gestured for them to sit. The wind moved softly through the willows, and the river whispered below like it was waiting to listen. "Finch," Henry began, "wasn't a hero, nor a Finch. Villain. He was the kind of man this country made when it was young and mean. He lived by a rule older than the law, older even than the flag they'd just started sewing back east. Out here, a man's word was the whole of his worth. You broke it, you died for it. Not because the law said so, because the land did. He leaned back, pipe glowing faintly. They say he killed a man. But it weren't murder, not by the reckoning of those days. They called it a duel, though both men lost something more than blood. One lost his honor, the other his place in the world. The army made a trial of it, and from that trial came the first written law west of the divide about what we now call manslaughter. I reckon it was justice, but not the kind the mountains understood. The students wrote quickly, heads bent. Henry chuckled. You write that down neat and tidy, but it won't read true. You can't print the sound of a rifle echoing off snow peaks or the look in a man's eyes when he knows the world's changing faster than he can hold it. You can't write the silence that comes after. One of the young men looked up. So you believe the wilderness had its own justice? Henry nodded slowly. Still does. You listen long enough, the land'll tell you right from wrong. Same as the river here, it don't stop running just because men build bridges. It remembers what came before. The sun dipped lower, staining the water gold. Duke whined softly and laid his head on Henry's boot. The oldest of the students hesitated, then asked, Do you think Finch ever found peace? Henry stared at the river for a long time before answering. Peace ain't a place a man finds. It's what finds him if he stands still long enough. I think Finch found it the moment he stopped fighting the world and started listening to it. He tapped the ashes from his pipe. You boys came here for history, but what you really came for was understanding. So I'll tell you, plain. The West wasn't built on gunfire or law books. It was built on men learning to live with the land, and the land teaching them they weren't bigger than it. Finch learned that the hard way, and because he did, the rest of us didn't have to. The student said little after that. The wind had gone still, and the river's voice filled the space between them, steady, unending. When the young men finally left, the sun was gone, and the stars had begun to blink over the peaks. Henry watched their car rattle off down the trail until its headlights vanished into night. Then he turned back toward the river. Well, old friend, he said softly, looks like they'll be writing about you again. The current moved on, dark and sure, carrying the starlight like silver coins. Henry sat until the chill crept through his coat. He thought of Finch, of Sheriff Nate, of the duel, the trial, the letter found in some forgotten chest. All of it had become history, now ink on, paper. But here, in the hush of the valley, it still breathed. He smiled, closed his eyes, and listened. The river was speaking again, as it always had. And if a man listened close, he could almost hear words beneath its murmur, old, familiar, patient as eternity. Laws fade, stories twist, but the river remembers.